Good evening, and welcome on this snowy night. I'm Susan Galassi, Senior Curator of the Frick Collection, and I'd like to welcome you to the third lecture in connection with our current exhibition, Masterpieces from the Scottish National Gallery. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Michael Gallagher, the Sherman Fairchild Conservator in charge of paintings conservation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and a close friend of the Frick. While the Frick's chief conservator, Joseph Godla, oversees the restoration of sculpture and decorative objects here, the paintings fall under the care of Mr. Gallagher, and we consult with him and his colleagues Dorothy Mann and Charlotte Hale on a regular basis. After training at the Hamilton Kerr Institute at the Fitzwilliam Museum at the University of Cambridge, Michael Gallagher began his career in the United States, first as a fellow at the John Paul Getty Museum in California, and then as associate curator at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. In 1995, he went to the Gemälde Gallery in Berlin, where he was responsible for conserving the wings of the Master of Darmstadt's altarpiece and Rubens' St. Gregory the Great and Saints, to name only a few works. More relevant to this evening, from 1999 to 2005, he was Keeper of Conservation at the National Galleries of Scotland. Paintings by Elsheimer, Gainsborough, Murillo, Tiepolo, and many others came in for treatment by Mr. Gallagher during his stay in Edinburgh. The highlight of his years there, however, was the conservation of Botticelli's Virgin Adoring the Sleeping Christ Child, a thrilling odyssey that we will hear about tonight. For the past decade, Mr. Gallagher has served as conservator in charge of Paintings Conservation Department at the Metropolitan Museum. Early in his tenure, he initiated and oversaw the major refurbishment of the Painting Conservation Center that was completed in March of 2009. There, in that welcoming environment, he regularly meets with curatorial colleagues, students, and experts from all over the world to discuss his work in progress and often thorny issues of attribution. While restoring works by Poussin, Ribera, Rubens, Del Sarto, and others in the Met's collection, Mr. Gallagher also undertook the conservation and cleaning of one of the Frick's greatest paintings, Velázquez's Portrait of Philip IV, and co-authored an article on it for the Burlington Magazine with the former Frick Fellow, Pablo Perez Dors. Fresh from his research on the Frick painting, he re-examined the Met's own Portrait of Philip IV, then thought to be a workshop production of Velázquez, recovering the hand of the Spanish master from beneath layers of overpainting and yellow varnish. This exciting discovery was presented in an exhibition at the Met organized by Keith Christensen, the John Pope Hennessy Chairman of European Paintings, with the participation of Mr. Gallagher and Jonathan Brown. Currently on Mr. Gallagher's easel, or maybe two easels, is the Met's stunning new acquisition, Charles Lebrun's monumental portrait of Eberhard Jabach and his family, which is being prepared for presentation in the galleries. Over the course of his career, Mr. Gallagher's publications have contributed illuminating insight into the cleaning and restoration of works, not only by Velázquez, but also by Benjamin West and Michelangelo. This past month, Michael has generously shared with Frick audiences his insights into the making of our visiting Scottish masterpieces, as he will do tonight in a special focus on Botticelli. The exhibition will remain open for a half hour after the lecture. Please join me in welcoming Michael Gallagher back to the podium at the Frick.
Good evening, and I'd like to add my own thanks to you all for coming out on such a horrible night. Thank you, Susan, for a very gracious and fulsome introduction there. It's one of the great pleasures of working at the Met to our association with the Frick, which goes back a long way, long before my time, under one of my predecessors, John Brearley. We work very, very closely. In the past, I worked very closely with Colin Bailey under Anne Poulet, and now it's my great pleasure to work closely again with Xavier Solomon under Ian Wardropper, and always with Susan, who is always such a gracious collaborator. So thank you so much. When the Frick asked me to give this lecture, I was surprised and delighted. I suppose I was delighted because the painting, the Botticelli, holds a very special place in my heart, as it were. Of all the paintings I've worked on, been lucky enough to work on in my career, this one really pulls the heartstrings somehow. I was surprised because I've spoken on the painting many years ago here at the Frick, not long after I first conserved it. And those of you who happen to have been at that lecture, there's not going to be very much news, so now's your time if you wish to leave. But the difference, I hope, the big difference is the painting is around the corner. So I will take you through how I first encountered the painting, the issues with condition, the treatment I undertook. I'll talk you through the painting technique that Botticelli used, and some of the insights that the intimate access to an object we're privileged to learn from. And I hope that way, when you go back to see the painting itself, it will focus you on its great qualities in a very different way. This is the painting sat on my easel in the painting conservation studio of the National Galleries of Scotland. The studio is actually based in the Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh, but this is just from the beginning of 2000. I first heard about the painting when Sir Timothy Clifford, then the director and then at the time plain Timothy Clifford, came to see me, and he had been made aware that this picture was on the market. He was somewhat surprised because he'd seen it, he'd had dinner in front of it in Gosford House in East Lothian, not far from Edinburgh, where it hung above the fireplace. And in some ways it had sort of slipped through the net. It hadn't been offered immediately to the National Galleries of Scotland. It had been spotted by the dealer Simon Dickinson, and after many years he asked the question that perhaps people hadn't been asking, which was, why isn't this Botticelli? It had become regarded as simply a copy, workshop copy. And they began a process of looking at the picture closely, and by the time we heard about it, they'd already there'd been a little cleaning test done, there'd been some infrared examination on the underdrawing, and Tim was very keen to sort of pursue the possibility of the galleries acquiring it. He was a formidable, or is a formidable character when it comes to acquisition, and I was sort of dispatched on the train down to London to see the painting in the work area of Simon Dickinson. The picture itself had sort of, for many years, it just sort of disappeared from public view. We can securely trace the provenance back to 1846. It was sold in the February of that year in the posthumous sale of the possessions of Baron Brunet de Nantes. He was the nephew of Baron Dominique Vivant de Nantes, and you can tell I'm reading this because I can never keep those straight. Baron Dominique Vivant de Nantes was the creator and curator of the Musée Napoléon. So it was his nephew's posthumous sale. It was sold to Bond Street dealer John Smith, who then sold it to Francis Charteris, who was the Lord Elcombe. Sorry, I've got that wrong. It went to Lord Northwick at that time. Lord Northwick had a house, Thurleston House, near Cheltenham, and he was amassing a collection of Italian paintings. And this is Thurleston House, and there is our Botticelli. From there, it was sold after his death to Francis Chartres, Viscount Elcho, who was later the Earl of Wemyss and March, the 10th Earl of Wemyss and March. He kept it in his London residence till around 1890s, and then it went up to the family home, Gosford House, where it remained until it was acquired by the National Galleries of Scotland. When I first saw the painting in the workroom of Simon Dickinson, it looked very different from the picture you see next door. I'd travelled down on the train and I'd been making notes to, I hadn't been very long at the National Galleries of Scotland, and I frankly felt a little bit out of my depth to go and examine a picture like this, because my role was twofold. It was in part to look at the condition and make a prognosis for treatment, but it was also clear that I was supposed to be looking to a degree at the quality of the picture, because there was still a lot of questions at the time of, is this really Botticelli? There was a very active workshop, very active followers, and the fear of any institution when you're buying a new painting that isn't absolutely 100% secure is no one wants to sort of buy something as a Botticelli and then later find out that they got it wrong. I spent the day before going to see it with a great colleague, Martin Wilde, who was former head of painting conservation at the National Gallery in London, and we were looking at workshop pictures and other paintings. And then finally I got to see it, and as they pulled it out, the first thing struck me was it was large. Always check the measurements before you go and see something, but it was larger than I was anticipating. But the first initial impression was a little bit, really? It seemed incredibly dark and somewhat dull. I knew already that it was on fabric, and I'll talk about that more later, which was unusual. But I was lucky in that I was able to spend about an hour and a half with it on my own, and it sort of cast a spell, because as I began to see past issues of condition of the discolored varnish, the qualities of the picture really began to come out, and I very quickly came round to the idea that this was a picture of singular quality, and agreed very much with the director that it should be acquired. Just to give you an idea of the level of discoloration of the varnish, this is a detail of one of the roses, and that tiny little light spot in the middle is a chip of the varnish that's come away, revealing the blue sky underneath. One of the interesting facts, when the painting was in a sense demoted over time, in some ways I should have said at the beginning, it's not so surprising with an artist like Botticelli that we can only go back to the 19th century, because his own sort of star dimmed after his death and was discovered, he was sort of rediscovered in the 19th century. But Bernard Berenson, the great connoisseur and art historian, had seen the painting in Gosford House and felt it was workshop. He was apparently, the anecdote, which I think is in the catalogue, is that he was thrown out of the house by in a thunderstorm for his impudence. But there is a note at his residence in Itati that he refers to, it said, the flesh like old brass. And there's nothing saying that he assumed that this was the varnish. I think that this maybe misinterpretation of varnish and condition led to his less than enthusiastic response to the painting. You can see here how you see for those of you who've already seen the picture, very little information in the background and the foliage. The sort of rose here, which discolored varnish does two things. It shifts the color because it's essentially a brown layer. So it does that differentially. It will have less impact on warm, amber, rosy tones. It obviously has a big impact, as you saw, on something like a pale blue of the sky. But it also, because it's a layer that's sort of broken down as it oxidizes, it forms a sort of milky, rather a pacified layer. And I think you can see that very well around the rose head in the leaves, that you're just not reading any of the information or separation of those. Again, here in the bottom left corner of the crane's bill, That fabulous color, that high aqua color that is visible now is not to be recognized at all. The picture also, aside from the issues of the discolored varnish and how it distorted things, was affected by a lining. As I say, it was on canvas, but it had been lined. That is the process when another canvas is adhered to the back. And so what you're seeing here is the original canvas. And then this is the lining underneath. It was probably done in Italy, we're thinking, because of the these sort of wire nails that were knocked in and turned back, which is very typical. And they held the lining in place, and then the edges of the original were just glued over that on this strainer here. The lining that had been used was very coarse. The actual original fabric is very fine, plain weave. But as you can see here, it's in a slightly raking light, but this is a detail of the reverse of the lining. These very strong lines of the weave and slubs and so on. And they had caused what we refer to as weave interference, that when a coarser weave of a lining is pressed against a finer original, it pushes, it accentuates certain lines of thread in the original, and you tend to get almost like a grid-like pattern. So it undermined the fineness of the picture, this texture. So I remember the painting arrived just before Christmas, if I remember rightly. And the Scots take, as you know, New Year, Hogmanay, very seriously. And so there's no one around for virtually the week. And I went in on my own and actually started the cleaning because I felt I needed the sort of peace and quiet of no one looking over my shoulder. And so you can see here cleaning test up in the sky and in the drapery of the Christ child. I thought this was a good detail to get a sense of that very dark varnish I'm talking about, very tawny, being removed from the veil of the Virgin. And I think one of the things you notice is these subtle tones where the white is pulled over the hair really sort of get lost under a layer like this. And here in the foreground foliage, these are the fingers of the Christ child on the edge of the drapery. You see the varnish is still in place up here, this opacified layer I was talking about with its own craquelure pattern, completely dominating the foliage. And this is, I mean, photos taken during the course of cleaning there's never real clarity there, sorry, I'll just go back. But you can see, I think, emerging the individual strokes of little plants and grasses. And this is down by the edge of the Virgin's mantle as the blue of her fabulous mantle appears with the strawberry plants and so on. And again, the difference with the varnish on. It's hardly surprising that so many people were more interested in their dinner at Gosford House than looking at this picture. This is the varnish being removed from the drapery. I'll come back to the condition of the drapery later, but as I said, this type of discolored natural resin really impacts on blues. So you see how it has a marginal effect on the red drapery, but across here it really impacts on the color. And the same in the sky, in this mixture of azurite and white, this unbelievable layer. One of the aspects of cleaning, and I'm fully aware that it's both controversial and unsettling for people, and I think sometimes it's because the change is so dramatic. When a picture like this has probably had numerous layers of varnish, I should say from the outset, of course, this is not the original varnish. This will be a varnish from the 19th century, very thick, thickly applied, probably more than one, and that is oxidized and discolored. But it, as well as the gains of the clarity that comes back, you also inevitably uncover damage that people weren't aware of. So when you see how thick this layer is beneath. And you come up here where I've cleaned, let me see if this one might work a little bit. I've taken the varnish off. What you're seeing here is losses to the upper lying paint layer, same here. And if I go to another detail, I'll talk a little bit more about the technique later, but this is an underpainting. It's not the final layer that Botticelli applied. So these sorts of damages inevitably come to the fore somewhat. And in this detail, the Virgin's mantle, this is before cleaning in raking light. And if you look down, I'm sorry this is a little out of focus, but this is a detail of the X-ray. And you could see these dark patches are paint losses. So I knew before cleaning in this area, both by the surface characteristics of the paint layer, but also from using the X-radiograph, that we were going to find a lot of paint loss in this area, which indeed I did. But the gain is the sort of gradual coming closer to the original intentions of the artist and the clarity that starts to emerge. So in this sort of tar-like mess, who would know that this delicate, both in coloring and drawing, these fantastic crayon bills would emerge. So this is the painting after cleaning. And what I in a sense, I'd point out is essentially this is an amazing condition. The areas that you'll notice straight off are these little white patches. Those are fills. And I'm cheating slightly because this picture is taken both after cleaning and structural work, but the same rule applies, that these are the little fills to bring glosses up to surface of the original. If you imagine, as I always say, if you imagine those little damages all pulled to one corner of the picture, it's a fraction of the paint surface. More serious often with paintings are the issues of abrasion from injudicious cleaning, and that definitely has happened in the blue drapery here, and a lot of loss along the edge there. But let me move on. So these are the gains. The same detail before and after cleaning, this sort of radiant clarity of both application, color, purpose that comes through after that varnish layer is removed. The same here with that rose I showed you, where all of this separates out into quite a different detail. The blue drapery, sadly, blue draperies of paintings of this period often have suffered. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the medium that was used, but I think sometimes it was a misunderstanding of the construction of the paint layers that caustic materials were used to clean, which disrupted the shadows. So you can sense here, I think, a little bit that it's been rubbed and abraded. And then the collar, fully after cleaning, where I was talking about, this is an underlayer, Botticelli's underlayer. I'll talk about that later in the mass, but then this top layer is not intact. It's flaked away wholesale in places. It seems it could be due to humidity, but it does seem to be that there was a sort of technical problem with that thick green used in the drapery. This separation of layers isn't seen anywhere else except in the actual green drapery. So perhaps it was too much medium used, too thick, but that resulted in this. The most important thing, though, is the flesh tones are impeccable. They're in extraordinary condition. And so I'm talking about issues of condition, so I'm pointing out the warts, but it's such a minor part of this picture that this is what I want to think about and concentrate on, is just how glorious the condition of this face is. So to go back to the structural issues, I first cleaned the picture, removed the varnish, removed overpaint and so on, and then the next step was to think about the structural. So as I'm just reiterating slightly, lined on this strainer, not the original strainer. If we look at the X-radiograph, you can see that the central bar isn't central. This was a reused piece of actual strainer. It was, we had it analyzed. It was sweet chestnut. Its construction tallied very well with a number of paintings from the 18th century that had been in the Royal Collection. It had a very particular joint construction, and so this had nothing to do with the original stretching of the picture. Again, this issue of the coarse lining canvas causing the weave interference. Relining a painting, particularly of this age, is something you don't take on lightly. But I felt the more time I spent with the picture, the more I examined the actual condition of the lining, that it did not belong on this picture. It was acidic, brittle, excessive amount of very, very old glue, and as I said, it impacted the surface greatly. So I made the decision to remove it. Before I removed it, I applied a facing, that is a Japanese tissue adhered to the surface temporarily to protect the surface while I do the structural work on the back. And the reason I'm showing this is as I started to apply the adhesive through the tissue, you can see it picking up on those prominent regular areas of the weave that have been pushed through by this coarse lining. This is after the painting had been taken off the strainer. The strainer itself, this is the joint I'm talking about, but was completely woodworm. I mean, the woodworm was dead and long gone, but the parts of the strainer you could have sort of compressed with your hand. The painting on the table, and I'll be referring back to this later with an anecdote about Keith Christiansen, so keep this in mind. But this is close up, and you can see the very dark brown is, in fact the lighter brown I should say, is this very acidic animal glue, the brush marks where it had been applied. This is beginning to remove it, and then free of it, the painting, which is of course you see in reverse, stained through the back. At this stage, I suppose we could have considered not lining the picture, but I believe sometimes the fetish of an unlined picture can take people to, as it were, to the dark side. A painting that is many, many centuries old like this, that has been impregnated with glue from previous lining, is a very vulnerable object. The actual original canvas is no longer a fabric as such. I mean, it is a fabric, but its material qualities are quite different. It's probably closer to a biscuit than a piece of cloth. To have left this unlined, I think would have put it at enormous risk. It certainly would never have traveled, so you'd never have seen it, but unless you went to Edinburgh. But I also felt very, very strongly that it would have caused problems in the future, and so I made the decision to go ahead with the lining. But before I did that, I wanted to reduce that weave interference I was talking about. So this looks, it always looks rather brutal seeing a great painting on a piece of industrial apparatus, but this is a low-pressure lining table, and the moment you're seeing it is during this moisture treatment. So the picture is sat on an all-cotton blotter. That's been slightly moistened. These little strips of canvas act as sort of ducts because in the corners over here there are little portals to pull out the air. So in placing over a membrane of mylar and turning on the vacuum, the air is pulled out and the sort of light pressure is applied across the entire surface by the mylar. Simultaneously, the table is brought up in temperature, And that process of lightly moistening and warming the picture over a period of time will gradually relax out that weave interference, which it did very successfully. But this is, the next image is just when I started, and you can see that very, very strong pattern that had been pushed through that this process successfully got rid of. We're now about to go back in time, because I discovered when I was putting this together that I obviously only took photographs of myself preparing a lining. We need the sound of the passing of time. Isn't this sad? I remember when I had dark hair and was thin. So this is, and that floral shirt, my God. But anyway, this is me stretching up the lining. This is when I worked at the Kimball Art Museum. So I stretch up the lining. I then, this is linen. It's then washed to decrimp it, because industrially wove fabric gets a very, very pronounced crimp, which is very susceptible to shrinkage. And so when you stretch it and wet it, with the fact that the canvas is taut around the strainer, it pulls out that crimp. You then repeat you re-stretch it. So this is it's completely wet. You completely re-stretch it, and then the next stage, now in a spotty pullover, is to apply, in this case, I'm doing what's called a beaver lining, which is, it's a heat seal adhesive. It's an adhesive that dries to a sort of almost like plasticky feeling film that is activated by heat for a nap bond to the original surface. It's very stable, it's very, very reversible. So this is it being applied. It's not very nice, that's why I'm wearing that mask. And then we move back to Edinburgh, but still very dark hair. New York did this. So I'm setting up here. I'm cutting the lining canvas, which the dark area you see. The dark area you see is the adhesive. I'm cutting it from its strainer. I'm moving it across over here, where there's silicone release paper, and also blotter underneath to cushion it. And then the painting is placed on top. And then the same idea, these little ducts are put around strips of canvas, as it were. And then the same mylar, the sheet to induce the vacuum and the pressure, and then the table is brought up to the activation temperature of the adhesive, and I wait with a worried expression. But the lining went extremely well. The next stage, so this is the painting, following cleaning, following lining. You see the new lining peeking out there, and with the retouches filled, and an initial very, very, very light varnish. So the point of the retouching is to suppress these damages so that you read the image as a whole, and without the distraction of extraneous little losses to the surface. In some ways, it's often easier to look at a detail to get the idea. So this is actually one of the more damaged areas of the painting in the corner of the crane's bill. So you have both here abrasion down to, you're seeing it in the canvas, losses down to the underlayer and the green here, and then one large loss, which I'm finding hard to see at this angle, but there's a large loss here somewhere. And then this is after the restoration, carefully integrating those little abrasions and then doing a little reconstruction to carry on the stem of the crane bill. Actually, that's where I want to be looking, up here. Everything we do in terms of a treatment is obviously documented, but it's also the materials used are as stable as possible, and they're completely reversible. So if someone wants to come along tomorrow or in 100 years' time and remove all this, they can do so very easily, and much more easily than when I clean the picture. And so we'll fade into the after restoration, which is the picture you see next door. And I think, just going back, I think it's important to bear in mind, in most cases, how little effect this has. There's more abrasion here, which was pulled together, but otherwise the picture is in in really wonderful condition. So, just take a glass sip of water. One of the questions about the picture was when was it painted? As I said, it was on canvas. There are two very, very famous paintings by Botticelli on canvas. There were probably many more that are lost to us. One is Palace in the Centaur in the Uffizi, and the other is, of course, The Birth of Venus, which was conserved and carefully studied several years ago, well, several years before I came to work on the Virgin during the Sleeping Christ Child. There is also, so it's interesting that these, which are both from the early 1480s, are on canvas. If I go back to, if you remember that the painting on the table, during the time the picture was in the studio, there were many, many visitors. And it's interesting because some people won't show their hand. They see the picture and they ask immediately, has such and such a body been to see it? What did they think? And this was my first experience with Keith Christiansen, who couldn't be here tonight, but I hope he's watching this. But he appeared. He is our chair of European paintings at the Met, and Keith is never one to sort of keep his opinion under wraps. And when he arrived, the picture was face up, but it was on the table, and he was a little frustrated because he couldn't sort of get far enough away from it, and it was on a board, and he said, is there any way we could put it on the floor? And he'd been so enthusiastic and interesting about the painting, I thought, well, I suppose it's fine. It felt very odd. But we lifted it onto the floor, and then those of you who know Keith know he's very tall, and immediately he just sort of straddled it. And it was one of the most alarming moments of my life. I thought, how will I explain this to the director? It seemed a good idea at the time. But what was fascinating, Keith said, it has to be the 1480s. The facial morphology is just like the Daughters of Jethro. And the minute he left, I got the books out and thought, what's he talking about? And this is Botticelli fresco. And these were the characters he was talking about. And I think when you look at those, you get it immediately. And if I do a detail and then cheat and reverse it, it is exactly that. It feels exactly that moment. Again, early 1480s. The other thing with the frescoes, these are in the Sistine Chapel, but which is in Ognissanti in Florence, again, early 1480s. I think you feel that same weight of folds and so on in this sort of fresco technique. The picture is essentially put together out of very simple materials, but it's the strength of the conception and the mastery of the handling of those materials that transform them into something else. As I say, it was a fine plain weave canvas, which I don't think was stretched over a strainer. If you look at the detail here on the left, what you're seeing is the original tacking edge, which wasn't trimmed away at any point in its history. And this schematic on the side is in a sense to draw attention to these are what we call cusping, where in the process of stretching, the weave of the canvas is slightly pulled out of alignment, creating this scalloping effect. And the paint layer goes completely up and over right onto these. And what is absent is what would be a typical line of loss, where if this picture had been nailed, I mean, you see the nail holes here. Sorry, I'm going to use this one. Here, which are pulling out the canvas weave. If this had been around the side of a strainer, hundreds of years old, there would have been a line of paint loss all along there. That was not the case. It seems most likely that the picture was stretched like this on a panel rather than like this. And this was indeed the case with The Birth of Venus. We know of a Mantegna in Berlin that's like this. And in fact, at one point in the Botticelli's history in the 19th century, it's referred to as on panel. And it seems most likely at that time it was still attached to its original panel. The canvas, once it had been stretched, was prepared with a very, very thin gesso ground, barely filling the interstices of the canvas, and then a very careful underdrawing was undertaken. So the image you're seeing here is a complete composite infrared, which reveals carbon-based underdrawing. What you find is it shows a very careful placement of form, real reliance on preparatory drawing to articulate and create the narrative in a clear, predetermined way. What is slightly difficult with someone like Botticelli is he does a lot of reinforcement of contour in the painting stage, but there are definitely evidence of a very thorough drawing. The drawing was carried out, the underdrawing, in what seems to be an aqueous medium with a brush, very fine brush. And there are some wonderful moments in it. Every single plant was drawn, including this one, which wasn't painted, this whole rose stem here, complete with leaves and so on. And I think probably it was left out because it interrupted the sight line of the Virgin and her slumbering child. And so this was left out. In the foreground, there were major changes made to the outline of the drapery. It was extended. It first started off here, and then it was extended much further over. And I think it was to create a much more dynamic contour. Contour is so crucial for the artist, and this is much more interesting, I think. From the underdrawing, the painting was built up sequentially in a very logical way, going from the background features through to the foreground. Very little overlapping and really very little change from the drawing stage. Most of the changes seem to have taken place at the drawing stage, not at the painting stage. He's using a very small group of pigments typical of the time, vermilion, ultramarine, azurite, 2 types of malachite, that's a green copper carbonate, red lake, black earth colors, and lead white. This painting is mainly an egg tempera painting, so the pigments are mixed with egg, but crucially, several areas use heat-bodied walnut oil for glazing shadows. And so that you find that in the blues of the drapery. And when I was talking before about people misunderstanding technique, that is the danger of if egg tempera is a very, very solid medium. I wonder whether in the 19th century, with an assumption that this was all egg tempera, something caustic was used that eroded slightly some of those shadowing details. And I say all of this, the pigment analysis and the medium analysis with such authority because I didn't do it. It was done by our colleagues in the National Gallery in London, Raymond White and Catherine Higgett. And the whole time I was in Edinburgh, I benefited so greatly from their participation and interest in these things, and they are, I would trust their analysis with my life. So just going into a detail of the hand, you see these dark areas show how he's bringing the paint right up to the contour. It's not overlapping. There's less material there. So very, very clear, very easy to read, the X-ray. In most cases, as I say, no overlapping. One of the big exceptions is in the sky, but for a good reason. The sky layer is brought right down here so that it peeks through the foliage in a very natural way. In the blue drapery, he uses underpainting, and that's seen in several areas and is very typical of the artist. So this wonderful ultramarine is underpainted with lead white locally, and this gives a kind of radiance to the blue, this very, very precious pigment, ultramarine, lapis lazuli. These wonderful, heavy, rich, sort of imperial folds, as it were. In the green drapery, there's a different type of underpainting, and this is a detail I showed you before of after cleaning, before restoration. And as I explained, the top layer of this paint over time had flaked away to some degree. So what we're seeing is a glimpse into a working method in that Botticelli constructed these areas with a mixture of lead tin yellow and malachite. I think I missed lead tin yellow out of the list of pigments, but that's a very beautiful pale yellow. And this would have been painted in a slightly bolder form, the actual folds, and brighter, and then that would have been uniform, sort of unified and quietened by the application of this medium rich green on top, which, as I say, has flaked away and had to be restored in the final stages. Wonderful sort of soft velvety folds he achieves with this technique. The foliage itself, again, very, very practical. Painted first an underlayer of black across all the areas where he was going to do dense foliage. You find that in the Primavera, you find it in the Birth of Venus. He then builds up it's one of the curious things of the drawing being underneath this. I haven't quite figured out how he did a black underlayer and whether he redrew, but he then lays in first the stalks, then the leaves, and then the flowers, in step by step. There are two different greens at use. In the drapery, the malachite is a natural source from the actual mineral malachite. In the leaves, it's an artificially produced one, which has sort of little spherical particles. He wouldn't have been interested at all whether it was artificial or natural. I'm sure it would have just been a particular color. And so he chose this color here. Possibly it had a slightly different texture, so the leaves certainly have, as you'll notice in the galleries, a certain level of thickness that permits, that gives them almost a incredible presence. If I go to this, I'll get back to that. This is the detail of the rose, and this is done first of all with a pale pink underlayer of red lake and white. The details are then laid in with a pure red lake or a little white around the edges here to get the petals, a little patch of yellow ochre in the middle, and then the stamens of these thornless briar roses are put in with lead tin yellow. And I think it's very strong evidence that these would have also been gilded ever so slightly, the stamens. They are, the paint as it ages naturally becomes more transparent, and because he painted over existing features, I think the flowers now are slightly more sort of tissuey and paper thin than they would have been. They would have been a little more intense in color, and I think though you perhaps would have seen some of the leaves and stems showing through, it's a little exaggerated now, but I think it has a great beauty despite that. And I have to say, I mean, when I was talking about the thickness of the leaves, you'll see that they have, as I say, a sort of a monumentality, and there's a precision to the way they're painted, and none of those leaves are just sort of in there for the sake of it. You feel every one of them has a role in the negative spaces it creates. And it was one of the first features when I looked at the painting before treatment that really began to resonate with me was the rigor behind these, and the control despite the thickness of the paint. And this would be a very gritty paint. It wouldn't be a very appealing paint to use. But as I say, the rigor of thought behind it, of placement, is so crucial to the impact of the picture. They had the stems painted in a slightly paler green, a little bit more lead tin yellow, and the serrated edges suggested that's darkened a little. It's not as clear as it would have been, but it's still there to see. And then again, this, as I say, the black underlayer, the same process of these little fronds and leaves creating this incredibly rich verdant bed for the Christ child to lie on. This wonderful violet in the foreground. These details are just in because who doesn't want to look at that? and then the strawberry plant in the side. And then I love just looking at the petals, every one of them considered at a different angle and level of foreshortening. Gilding was crucial to the work of Botticelli, who trained as a goldsmith, and there are two types of gilding: mordant gilding in the halo and the border here of the mantle, and shell gold used for the Stella Maris and on the green drapery. The different choice, mordant gilding uses an oil-based mordant that gold leaf, it's applied, it's allowed to go sort of just slightly tacky, and then the gold leaf is applied to it, and then what doesn't stick is brushed away. It creates a certain body, it creates a thickness, and is stronger in its impact. Shell gold is much more delicate, and so I think the choice was made partly iconographic, partly decorative. There you see, this, as you know from the previous slides, is very damaged, but there would have been a great deal more of these little dots and dashes to articulate the tops of the folds, the highlights. In pictures where these features are better preserved, they're really dazzling how he commands that use of material. One feature I just put in, I thought it was interesting, this is back to after cleaning, but I think it shows very clearly that the painting was framed very early, almost in mid-process. There are nail holes that have nothing to do with stretching, that seem to be about the attachment of the frame, but it's protected the edge, and if you look at the greens there that have not been darkened by the active light, you get a sense of how incredibly verdant that foliage would have been. The other interesting aspect is after it was framed, the sky received a sort of darker, almost like a wash of dark blue paint, and then a glare layer, which is an egg white varnish. It's just egg white beaten and brushed on. It was a popular thing to do. But that's discolored. It goes more gray than anything else, and it becomes rather insoluble. And that wasn't removed during the cleaning, so that's still in place. What I did do, because we felt after much discussion that it was too disturbing to frame, we didn't want to frame this out, and we didn't want to just end up with this curious pale blue band on the top. So I retouched that to sort of integrate it. It can be reversed at any time. And though the gilding would have been the last feature to be done, I want to save to the end the greatest glory of this painting, which is the flesh tones, which are, the flesh tones almost seem to sort of impart light to the picture. It's a sort of masterclass in egg tempera. Egg tempera, as you know, doesn't lend itself to sort of blending like oil paint. It's done with cross-hatching, and this is so finely wrought you barely see any of that cross-hatching of the brushwork. He used very ochre-rich paint to create the underlayers, which you're seeing here. So the modeling was gradually built up with successive layers of the ochre-rich paint, and then more mixtures of pale pink with white and lake and vermilion were brought into that to sort of gradually bring up the modeling in this luminous way, this wonderful highlight here on the lip. Sort of slightly darker pink was used around the eyes, a very fluid dark brown paint for the lashes and to describe the details of the eye, the nostrils and so on, and then this deep pink in the lips. It's wonderful control of contour. The hair of the Virgin is simply made of earth colors, but brings this sort of wonderful sort of amber note to a painting that's really dominated by this high blue, green and pink. And then he sort of deftly pulls very fluid white paint over the existing hair to create this sort of lacy diaphanous effect of her veil. Wonderfully handled. Again, in the hands, this tremendous, you see some of the cross-hatching here, but great control. And then this reinforcement of contour I was talking about at the beginning in the brown lines. And it's these little, just this tiny sliver of the blue showing through here, or this wonderful patch of light where the light is coming through the open fingers catching on the surface here. In the Christ child, same technique, but this very masterfully foreshortened little hand with these little rivulets of white just pulled down on the edges. And here, these wonderful lashes. Little abraded here, but you can see generally how wonderfully preserved they are. And tiny patch of light throws the whole head into the round. And this very fluid pale pink up here on the eyelid. As I said, the Christ child is obviously a key feature of the painting, and I talked about changes that were seen in infrared. When we first got the painting, we had access to some infrared images that had been made by a private firm, which were fine and showed certain amounts of drawings, but we upgraded our own equipment about a year or two after we acquired the painting. And it so happened that the painting had been on loan and was back in the studio when a colleague, Rachel Billings from the National Gallery in London, who's an expert in IR, was helping us set up our equipment. And I said, well, why don't we image the Botticelli? Because then we don't have to always acknowledge these other images are from somewhere else. We'll have our own. So they were working on it, and I think were most concerned with issues of clarity of imaging and the details of that. And I went in to see how it was going on, and I really remember very strongly this double take, because the Christ child, there was a significant difference. If you Google Virgin adoring the Christ child, these are sorts of the images that come up. Most images are of a lively little baby in various positions, sometimes uglier than others, but interacting, and the sense of the Virgin as the adoring mother, beautiful, sweet, moving images, some infinitely more profound, like this Lippi, but you will find a lot less with a sleeping Christ child. And of course, sleep has always been allied with death, and I think this pairing of these two Bellinis really, you fully understand what the meaning was of the mother who knows she is to lose her only son, and the use of the Pietà, of the figure draped over the lap of the Virgin, is entirely to remind you of when that man was a child. So going back to our Christ child, who is asleep, when the infrared was taken, I saw that he'd been drawn awake. So the ear is here, the eye is here, the hands were different. Let me go into detail, I hope you can see the... Aidan Weston Lewis in the catalogue, I think, doesn't regard this as significant. I fundamentally disagree. This painting, for me, has always been profoundly moving. I feel its beauty, in a way, can distract you from what a solemn poem, in a sense, it is. And I don't think it was a casual change. Yes, it was after the drawing was made, but this sense of meditation, of the Virgin even seems to stoop slightly more over the Christ child. This very, very still figure. The swaddling cloth almost feels like the drapery that the dead Christ will be wrapped in the future. The sense of the tomb here, the enclosed garden that is not anecdotal. There's no view of Florence in the background. This is a very, very spiritual, symbolic picture. And I think, in a sense, that delight I had when I was asked to talk about it again was really just for the opportunity, again, as a rallying call, that the painting is heartbreakingly beautiful, but it's that combination of the solemn meaning, the universal ideas of sacrifice and loss and grief, and then this exquisite technique and masterful painting that I think raises it to the title when I say A Masterpiece Revisited. Thank you very much.